Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today we have as our guest Carlos Zaccagnini de Ory, who will talk about his book. Carlos' book is well argued and contains great erudition, where you can find different theories and philosophical foundations about consciousness, hallucinogens, psychology, neurology, and epilepsy. So thank you for accepting our invitation, Carlos. And to begin with the interview, first I would like that you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us in a few minutes about your life.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Talia, for inviting me to your interview program. I'm very grateful and I'm honored to be here. So I would also like to greet your video viewers and wish them a good evening. So to start with, I would say that my life, which is now relatively long, has been marked by travel. I was born in Madrid, in Spain, but moved out of Spain with my family early in my childhood. And then I've been traveling more or less since I was a child. My father, he was posted out in the Middle East, which is where I began to study and grew up. And then he moved away from the Middle East to Pakistan, where again I finished my secondary English education in the Karachi Grammar School. So from the Middle East to Pakistan, then they moved my father to Switzerland. So we followed, and I finished my studies there. Then I went on to university in the UK, where I earned a bachelor's degree in the Faculty of Sociology, and I specialized in the history of religions. After I finished my university, instead of settling down, I said I must continue in the footsteps of my father and keep on traveling. I said that a settled life, an urban life, was not for me. So after my university studies, I took my backpack and came over to Latin America, and then traveled. And then more or less I spent thereafter, well over 10 years in Latin America, traveling partly, then in the Amazon, where I settled for many, many years. I lived there, well, without any means, and finally it was too hard in a way. We had two girls there. They were growing up, and finally we left the jungle. But as I said, after many, many years living out in the bush, as they say, then I had to look for my family. So I looked for a job for the first time in my working life. I was 42 by then. And I was fortunate, or my destiny, my karma was such that from the Amazon, a few weeks later, I was serving the UN refugee agency in Iraq just after the first Gulf War. That puts us in 1991. So it was then that I sort of began a new life, but not a settled one, because with the organization I worked for, I kept on traveling. I moved about for the following 20 years from one conflict zone, war zone to another, assisting and protecting refugees. So that was also well over 10 years ago. So during these last 10 years, I've been retired, and this is when, in fact, I've started to write. So this is a brief biography.
Yes, thank you. Actually, you tell a lot about it in your book. Yes, and it's very nice. How do you explain it? So I would like that you speak why you came to write about your books. You know, I mean, when came this idea that you have?
Well, actually, it's been quite recent. It's not an idea I had for ever and ever, or a long time ago, or that it was a plan. No, I started, in fact, to write my memoirs, which I've already published in 2 volumes. And I said, that's it. I will now put writing to rest. I've done what I wanted for a long time, which is to write about my life's journey, as it were. So I finished that, and then shortly thereafter, this impulse, or this something just got hold of me and said, "Oh, but you must write this," and this is in fact the title of the book, which is Epilepsy, Entheogens, and Consciousness. In fact, the book is about all 3. It's not only about epilepsy, and it's not only about entheogens. Entheogens is a relatively new word in the English language. It was coined in order to name sacred plants that have an effect on those that ingest them, and that effect is conducive to revealing your divinity, as it were. So it's a word that means that there are substances that reveal that you are, in fact, sacred, which of course sounds very difficult to acknowledge and recognize in our culture, in our society. We killed the spirit long ago, and anything spiritual is not, as it were, in the mainstream, acknowledged or very much accepted. Anyway, entheogens signifies sacred plants, and why a new word? And this is because attempting to write about these sacred plants, one was caught with the terminology of drugs. So these sacred plants are not drugs, and the connotations of drugs is inappropriate. Just as they argued, those that coined the word, just as these sacred plants don't actually produce hallucinations. Anyway, this is a long debated theme, which I address in the book. But again, this is to stress and to have some idea about what entheogens are. Okay, so this is my insistence in what are entheogens. They are sacred plants, and the word is so new and convoluted because they wanted to make it sure that
Yes.
it was not, other type of drugs, as it were. Okay, so the third theme of the book is consciousness with a capital C. And there in the book it is explained that consciousness means very many things to a lot of people in different cultures. And in our own consciousness has also several meanings. I give examples of, consciousness then is difficult to pin down and say, when you discuss consciousness, okay, what consciousness? Define it for me, etc. So the book is about consciousness with a capital C, which is meant to address higher states of consciousness. So it's not about consciousness in general, as in states of consciousness. So I explained that we are not very familiar with the fact that we have several states of consciousness. First of all, we have three, which are, of course, everyday experience, but we don't grasp it, which is this state of consciousness we are in now, which is a wakeful, you could call it, state of consciousness. Then there is, of course, the dream state of consciousness when you have these dreams. It's certainly not a wakeful state. It is very much different, and it's called different, and it feels different. So humans have that other state of consciousness, which is dreaming, which is phenomenal. I mean, the word of dreams is is very, very, very deep. So there you are. There is a second state of consciousness. Then a third, which we are even less familiar with, because you could argue that, okay, we are not conscious of it, which is deep sleep. But deep sleep qualifies, of course, as a state of consciousness, except perhaps you are not aware of it, in that it is so vital for our existence. Deep sleep is when all these strange things occur in the body that kind of make it possible for you to wake up the next day. The circadian cycles, and anyway, the deep sleep state of consciousness, very much put aside in our society. We sleep, okay, because we need to, and as I said, the dream and the wakeful. But there is a fourth state of consciousness, which is even less addressed. Of course, I mean, in the mainstream of the culture, of the Western culture. Now, you could argue that the cat is out of the bag, in the sense that higher consciousness is now in the kind of word and mouth of everybody. Okay, so higher states of consciousness are different from the other three, and many cultures argue that it is in fact the underlying force of the other three. So that higher consciousness, higher states of consciousness, of which there are several high states of consciousness, are not by our culture acknowledged. I repeat, of course, now everybody more or less understands that perhaps, yes, there are higher states of consciousness. Oh, and what are they? Oh, let's go out to look for them. So because, of course, our society doesn't acknowledge, whereas, for example, Hinduism and generally Eastern cultures, they put a big emphasis on the higher state of consciousness. They put big emphasis on it. In fact, it comes as the first and foremost source of the universe. As simple as that. Our culture, of course, does not view consciousness in that manner, because we view the universe as made up of matter, dead matter. And in that regard, it has no consciousness in it. Or if it does, which of course it does, then it is just, as it is called, an epiphenomena of matter. So nothing very important. In fact, when first the West started to explore higher states of consciousness at the beginning of the 20th century, with new tools like psychology, yeah. Initially, they termed higher states of consciousness and those that pretended to have them as crazy or insane, or they had a pathology. Yeah. So high states of consciousness at the beginning of our search in the West, it was, made kind of a pathology. Then slowly, in 100 years, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot from others. I mean, if you see the influence of Hinduism, of yoga, of Buddhism with meditation, and of Zen, and also many doctrines, whatever you want to call them, that address higher states of consciousness. Yeah. So they've come to help us. So that is the higher states of consciousness. And those are the higher states of consciousness which I address in my book, together with entheogens that produce those higher states of consciousness. And the as it were, novelty of the book, or the unforeseen aspect of the book, if you want, is to put epilepsy in it. Because epilepsy, of course, there is a lot of literature on epilepsy, scientific and less scientific. There is a lot of literature, but only on epilepsy. And there is now an increasing amount of literature on entheogens. Right. Since the 50s and 60s, and now in the 21st century, it's a big, big revolution, entheogens. Yeah. These plants, or now you call them ayahuasca, call it magic mushrooms, call it LSD, call it what you want. These kind of substances, yeah, they, well, are now much more acceptable, even though, of course, they are still not the mainstream. They are still illegal in many ways. But they are much more acceptable, much more than 50 years ago, when they were actually forbidden, prohibited, and they started a war. I mean, there is a war which is still ongoing, a war on drugs. Yes. Yeah, billions and costs, and many thousands of lives lost, etc. A war on drugs in general, I would say, but in any case, it included these entheogen substances. So entheogens and consciousness both have been addressed in their own literature extensively, even though consciousness, as I said, was evolving in the West for 100 years with psychology, transpersonal psychology, and all these other Western and Eastern doctrines and so on. So consciousness is a theme which is very widely addressed. There's many studies and books and universities and whatever, as well as entheogens. So we can see that there are three pillars, three worlds, which have their own lives. Yeah, epilepsy in many ways has not been made relevant to entheogens or consciousness before that I am aware. So to bring the three together, yeah, is in many ways, I would say, an achievement, which was only possible, and this is an important part of the whole book. It was only possible for me to address these three separate things together and make them relevant to each other. Yeah,
Yes.
because I have experienced all three.
This is amazing. It's actually what I love about the book, because yes, it's true, like you say, that it's many other academic research about epilepsy and things, but you never will find this kind of approach where someone lays together the history of epilepsy and then the history of sacred plants, and then the history of consciousness. Yes, because all of these three, you make like a very brief history of them, but very well done, consistent. And
Thank
then
you.
it's like, wow, he's like speaking about all these, in this small book. I mean, it's not so like thousand of pages, and you really make a point. So it's really, I mean, I really like it. Sorry. So I wanted that you speak now. Uh,
Please.
yeah, exactly. That beautiful book. Yes. I don't know how many pages have printed, but in the
400 and some, 420 something.
yeah, so it's easy. It's easy to read it. I mean, it's not well. It's not so easy because he have like a lot of books like he quote and he say it in order to justify the knowledge, but it's easy to read it because it's not so big. Yes. um, so tell me a little bit more about you, because you approach the consciousness and you approach the sacred plants and epilepsy from a different point of view that everybody. Yes. So tell me, do you follow any religion or any spiritual path? And if yes, how the epilepsy helps you to find your spiritual path? And
Yes. Um, about my life and my kind of meeting with these topics in my life were very early on. So, in fact, my first convulsions were when I was an adolescent, 14, 15 years old. So that came first. And it was a pretty, not a very nice phase of my life, I would say, my adolescence, because of the treatment that I was put under, of which I was later so critical and was able to address through personal experience. So I spent several years under medication for epilepsy, of course, not knowing what epilepsy was and just being told what the doctors were saying and taking the advice of my parents, who, etc., etc. So when I went to university, things started to change because to start with, it was in the late 60s, early 70s. So I started to smoke hashish and I took LSD, and then I started to, in the academic field, began to be in contact with Eastern religions and doctrines because I was studying the history of religions. So all of a sudden, early on, I was already reading the autobiography of a yogi by Yogananda, an incredible book of all ages. Yeah. And I was, as I just said, having my own entheogen experiences, which were wow. Plus, I was taking medication for epilepsy, which at the time hasn't changed very much, but at the time was very noxious medicine, phenobarbital, with deplorable secondary effects. So during the time I was in the UK doing my studies, these three currents or waves, my convulsions, the entheogens, and the things that I was studying, wow, it led me to a number of decisions. I said, well, when I finish here at university, I will never be able to go and start to work and have a family and so on. I really took to heart what was going on culturally or counterculturally in the environment I was in. We said, that it was not sustainable, that we wanted something else, etc. So I was one of a few that said, okay, then cut completely. So I finished my university and my degree, and I worked for a few months to collect some money. And then I went, as I said earlier, in my brief biography, I came to Latin America. And here, of course, during the many years I spent here in the bush, in the jungle, etc., there, so many things happened. I decided to stop my medication, because many people decide to stop their medication, perhaps not enough people. But then when they do so, they are in the same basic environment that produced that medication. So it's very hard for people with epilepsy in the system to stop medication, and if they don't seek alternatives seriously, then of course it could be worse than not. Of course, I stopped and then left the system completely. I was either traveling or in the bush completely, and there, no medicine of the noxious kind, yeah. And then, of course, I was realizing taking psilocybin in ritual fashion, etc., and much later ayahuasca and so on, that, of course, these were real medicine and not the other, which fortunately, as I said, I decided to stop. So when I decided to leave the system and travel, I said, stop medication. It was a lifetime decision. And then, of course, what happened next was another incredible chapter, which is, of course, what later prompted me to write the book. What happened subsequently is that when I stopped medication, my convulsions, of course, continued, but they had a basic difference from previous convulsions. In order to explain that very briefly, in the scientific terminology, an epileptic event is divided into three parts. A pre-ictal, ictal is the name given to the event, pre-ictal, the ictal, and a post-ictal. A pre-ictal is generally in the literature said to be a déjà vu, an aura, some sort of feeling, experience, that in many ways is said to announce what's coming, and is also said by many to be something that you've already felt. Anyway, that's a pre-ictal. The ictal itself is the convulsion, where generally you lose consciousness. And then the post-ictal, with medication, it's just the continuation of the ictal, but without the convulsions. You just continue to be unconscious, or let's say sleep, very, very deep sleep, of which you come out normally with a very heavy headache. And of course, there is the result of if you've bitten your tongue and your body and so on. So the post-ictal is a black hole. It's still unconscious, and then it's a pretty bad wake up. Yeah, that's how you would describe the post-ictal with medication. The post-ictal without medication, in my experience, of course, but I have already, through this marvelous thing, which is the internet, corroborated my story through those of others who are reporting similar stories, which is that without medication, the post-ictal of an epileptic seizure can be, well, an entry into higher states of consciousness, would you believe? Now, when I realized that, I said, well, this must be developed and researched and perhaps even be confirmed that yes. So that's exactly what I did. So I didn't leave my experience and said, well, this is, the whole thing. I went out to see, and then I realized that epilepsy, wow, was something completely different from the epilepsy that we kind of deal with in our culture. It's an illness. You go to the doctor, and then you are medicated, and you have to be looked after. You have some limitations. There are secondary effects. Blah blah blah. That is epilepsy in our world, and it is understood that epilepsy is an illness of the brain, of the head, and it is understood that the brain is full of neurons and that there is electricity. So there is a whole kind of world around epilepsy, which a lot of it is unconscious in people's minds, but it's there. That is a well understood scientific illness that is produced by a lot of electricity or whatever. But there is a background to that world. Epilepsy, of course, outside of that world is so many more things, in other cultures. But in history, the moment you start to be interested in epilepsy, which of course, if you suffer from it, you would be, if, for example, your medication is not, making you feel very happy, which it doesn't. So then research on epilepsy makes sense. So as soon as you start digging, you go beyond the end of the 19th century, i.e. behind earlier, then you start seeing another world. And the further back you go, the more astonishing epilepsy becomes. Because epilepsy, you realize, has been mentioned since the beginning of writing, of oral traditions, of engravings, of whatever. It's way back. Epilepsy has been described with the symptoms, etc. And if you dig further, you see that, of course, different cultures had different ideas, if you want, about epilepsy. And you dig further, and I realized what is really incredible, and that is that many cultures, and especially earlier ones, but cultures still today, they view epilepsy as a sacred illness. Again, what is sacred illness? That's our attitude, yeah. So, but look behind. Okay, what is sacred illness? And why was it ever called sacred illness? I mean, so there is a whole world behind why epilepsy is. You start realizing if you go to the relevant literature like ethnology or anthropology, you come out with incredible results, like realizing that one of the mainstays of the shaman, one of his tools, is an epileptic fit. And that epilepsy kind of marks a shaman. I.e., if you have epilepsy, you are kind of identified with it. Because a convulsion, what I said earlier, the post-ictal, gives you access to higher states of consciousness. And that is where the shaman went in order to seek cures for the people who came to seek help from him. So that knowledge that was necessary for him to do his job was, in fact, as I said in my book, many shamans go to this world of higher consciousness through sacred plants, which is what now is more kind of acceptable. Yeah, that shamans take ayahuasca and shamans and so and so, and shamans in Siberia, take Amanita muscaria, and that, of course, is one story. But can you realize the impact it has on an epileptic to realize that shamans also went to that world through epilepsy? That's quite. So you can go on and on and on and on, and you will discover a world of epilepsy that you wouldn't have dreamt of. Just to finish off on this issue, not all cultures saw the epileptic fit as leading to the spirit, to the higher consciousness. Many, and particularly ours, but also what are called perhaps Semitic cultures, the cultures of the book, of the monotheistic cultures, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Unlike other cultures, and unlike earlier shamanism, didn't see epilepsy as the sacred disease. They saw epilepsy as evil and satanic. It was evil, kind of the jinn in Islam or the devil or whatever. And these religions passed on to us, to the Semitic cultures which dominate the world today, this idea that epilepsy, is well, perhaps not evil today because people don't believe in those things, perhaps, but in any case, it's not sacred by any means. On the contrary, it's something bad that you have to stop, that you have to control, that doesn't need to be there. So that viewpoint, which is the opposite of a sacred disease, is also there. And it begs the question, why is epilepsy so prominent in history, and why is it, so divided, as it were, in, good and bad? It is a paradox. It is a paradox that it's like the same paradox as the one of consciousness. Consciousness, we said earlier, in the East is the source of the universe, whereas consciousness in the West is nothing. So that's a paradox. And I insist because these are the topics I address in my book. The topic of consciousness you find in the East, as I said and repeat, it is the source of everything, you and I here and everything else. Yeah. In the West, things are changing, yeah, in the West, of course. But the classic scientific viewpoint, of course, is that consciousness, is irrelevant in the universe. The same, it's a paradox, yeah. Very bad for some, or not existent at all, and vital, the most important thing for the others. Epilepsy, sacred for some, and evil, control for others. War on it, yeah. War on drugs, war on epilepsy. Because this is exactly how they treat epileptics. It's war on the symptoms. Yeah. But if you realize that the symptoms without that war, yeah, can lead you through further inward exploration, then you have a different world of epilepsy.
Yes, it's true. I also have epilepsy, so I can relate to your comments a lot.
There you are.